Dr. Kang, thanks very much for your time. I want to first begin by asking you, we've moved since the time the two vaccines in India were given a go ahead, and we are now at a phase when the trials have started. However, recently we came across the news that Covaxin trials with the phase 3 trials with the Bhopal gas tragedy victims did not really augur well. I want to first get your opinion on how out of the ordinary it is for a vaccine to be given emergency use approval while the phase 3 data is still not out and the trials are still going on.
So to have a vaccine used without any efficacy data available is very unusual. It's not like it never happens. It did happen in the case of the Ebola vaccines, where you had a disease that had a very high case fatality rate. About 40% of people who had an Ebola infection died. And Ebola does not really have effective treatments, or did not at that time. Now we know that some monoclonal antibodies work. But it also appeared that if you were exposed to Ebola, you had a very high chance of protection if you were given the vaccine, because Ebola has a very long incubation period. From the time you come in contact with a person who has Ebola, one, your chances of getting infected are high, but you also know that it will take 3 weeks for the infection to manifest itself. So in 3 weeks, we know that the immune response the immune response that is mounted for a vaccine, it can protect within 3 weeks, right? It usually takes about 2 weeks for the response to start, and by 3 weeks, it's reasonable. So based on all of that, though the phase 3 vaccine trials with the vaccine were done and were conducted by the WHO, there were also a limited number of people who were given the vaccine outside of trials on humanitarian grounds. Now, Ebola is very different from SARS-CoV-2, because in SARS-CoV-2, you have a short incubation period. It's only 2 to 5 days. You're not looking at vaccinating only contacts. You're looking at vaccinating the population at large. The case fatality rate is much less. In India, we believe that it's somewhere around 1%, not 40%. So there are a lot of differences between what has been done for emergency use authorization before and what is being proposed now. It's also important to understand that while emergency use authorization has been given to the Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca vaccines, which means that they need to be used in a very monitored fashion in large populations, all of those approvals are based on the availability of efficacy data. But in India, we have at least one vaccine for which we have very high hopes. It has an excellent clinical development program, but we actually have no data at this time. So it's a question of, do you take it on faith? Do you take it on hope that the vaccine will work? Or do you do it on the basis of data? And at least in my view, that data is not yet available for at least one of the candidates that has been given emergency use authorization. Coming to the second question that you had about what is being reported from Bhopal, and I understand that Bharat Biotech has come out with a statement that says that some of the facts are inaccurate. So, for example, the idea that people were paid 750 rupees to participate in the vaccine trial, Bharat is absolutely accurate in saying that in clinical trials, you do compensate people for their time for coming into the facility, making multiple visits. And the amount of compensation is something that is decided by the ethics committee. It's expected to be something that is not an inducement, but at least shows people that you value their time. So in that sense, I think that Bharat's argument is perfectly valid and is likely to be absolutely what the ethics committee and the investigators have done. What is otherwise concerning, and have, I don't have any direct evidence of this, only what I've read in the media, that there are participants who don't have their informed consent forms, participants who did not know that they were participating in a trial, participants who thought that they were getting vaccine, participants who were unwell, some of whom had their medical expenses paid, others who did not have their medical expenses paid. All of these are concerns, and each of them needs to be looked into. We do know that sometimes people lose study documentation, and the copies of those documents would be available in any case with the study team, because that's a requirement. You have to have copies of the informed consent form. But if we listen to the stories that people have said, that when they went back for a visit, their study documentation was taken away from them. All of these are things that require investigation, because in a clinical trial, there are a couple of things that are critical. One is you should not be going to people to participate in a trial who are considered vulnerable in any sense. This is one reason why we would not include, for example, prisoners or pregnant women in any kinds of studies. And particularly, you wouldn't recruit very poor people, because you will have this worry about inducement to participate. The other thing that is important in a clinical trial is when you take informed consent, it has to be informed consent. And it is a process, it's not a one time thing. So if people within 2 months of participation are saying, we didn't know we were in a trial, then you really do need to look into what that informed consent process was. Because in many of the trials that we do, we actually have a requirement of a test of understanding, which is you ask the participant to repeat back to you what they have understood about what the study entails, and you can then record that, or you give them a little test of 3 or 4 or 5 questions, and you assess their understanding. And if they don't meet that standard that you have set, let's say 3 or 4 out of 5 questions must be answered correctly, then you don't enroll them in the trial. So these approaches are approaches that careful clinical trialists take. And in fact, in one of the studies that I did as a PI for the site, for Bharat Biotech, in fact, required for us to have a patient narrative written down stating that this is what the patient says in their own words, what they have understood about the trial. So it doesn't sound to me, at least from what I've heard, that either of these approaches to assess whether appropriate informed consent was taken has been evaluated or not. But it's not a requirement for every study, and if the protocol didn't require it, then I'm sure that the PIs followed whatever the protocol said, but that wasn't sufficient to ensure that consent was truly informed.
Ma'am, would you say that the approval per se was done in a hurry? Because that's a concern a lot of people have at the moment, that we perhaps did not follow the law to the T, or rather the guidelines that were put out by ICMR to the T, and we did end up bending a few rules here and there to ensure that the vaccines are approved in a hasty manner. That, of course, is a concern, and that is a question that lingers on in the minds of people. What is your opinion of the manner in which the vaccines were given approval?
So in September of 2020, the Drug Controller General of India had come out with a guidance document saying that this is what we will require of vaccines when you want to bring them to us for approval. They said we want an efficacy of at least 50%. We want safety data of at least 2 months for at least half the people that are recruited into the trial. And it was pretty specific that these are the situations in which we will want bridging trials, essentially saying that if a vaccine candidate has trials done outside of the country, we will ask for bridging trials, much smaller studies within the country. And if efficacy trials are being done in the country, we'd like to see at least interim efficacy data, and that should be above 50%. Now, my understanding is that with AstraZeneca, the data that was submitted to the regulator for an emergency use authorization or its equivalent was the data that was from the AstraZeneca vaccine and was limited data from the 1,600 people that Serum had recruited into their trial. And of those 1,600 people, 400 were supposed to be in an immunogenicity cohort and 1,200 were additionally followed up for safety. Now, again, my understanding is that not all of the immunogenicity data was submitted. And if you look at the timelines, Serum finished recruitment at the end of October, which means everybody in their 1,600 participants would have received their second dose by the end of November. When you do the immunogenicity assessment, you usually take blood 4 weeks later, which means by Christmas, all of the samples should have been collected. And it was only a question of testing those samples from 400 people that needed to be done in order to complete all that Serum was supposed to do. Okay? So I don't understand what the hurry was for submitting for the equivalent of an accelerated approval or an emergency use authorization, because you could finish the testing by today, right? That's the Serum story. Then we look at the Bharat story, where Bharat has done much larger clinical testing than Serum. They had 800 people in their phase 1 and phase 2 trials. They have now apparently finished their recruitment of 25,800 people who will have received, at least all of them will have received one dose, and maybe, a third or half have received the second dose of the vaccine. So from here on, 2 weeks after your second dose, the clock starts ticking for counting the number of cases that can be introduced into an analysis. And they are expected to have 130 total cases at the end of the study, but 43 cases for an interim analysis. Now, if you look at Pfizer and Moderna, they finished their recruitment in September and declared their results by November, right, for the interim analysis. We understand that the epidemic is raging in a very different form in the US compared to India. And it might take a little longer in India to accumulate those numbers of cases. But you can actually counter that by increasing the size of the study and the number of people that you have recruited into the trial. The bigger the size gets, your number of cases is not going to change, but you should be able to get those cases faster. Now, if you are making a product that is going to be a product used for India and then the world, I would want the strongest possible clinical testing data available. Where we are today is we have an emergency use authorization that's based only on phase 1 and phase 2 data, which is safety, which is immunogenicity, which looks very promising. But promising is not a guarantee of efficacy, right? Nor is 800 people safety sufficient for us to be confident that we can now put this vaccine into the arms of millions of people. So I know that I'm sounding very cautious. I'm sounding like I'm delaying scientific progress in some shape or form. But the problem with all of medicine is that the risks are so unknown. What are we seeing with Pfizer today? Pfizer is seeing cases of anaphylaxis, which were not picked up in their 44,000 people trial, right? It's when you start to give millions of doses. The Pfizer risk is estimated today at anaphylaxis in 1 in 90,000 participants. Anaphylaxis may not have been picked up in a phase 3 trial, I agree. But is it possible? We made such a hue and cry about the cases that were seen with AstraZeneca. And so we should, because every potential adverse event or adverse event of special interest should be investigated, but you have a little more confidence when the vaccine has been in tens of thousands of people rather than in hundreds of people. This is why regulators are supposed to be doing their job, saying that we need to see at least this much data. So in September, you said, this is the data we want to see. And in January, you're saying, well, we are approving anyway. And if you look at the language that the subject expert committee did, and they have said, as a matter of abundant caution, restricted use. So the distinction between the serum product and the Covaxin product was made clear by the subject expert committee, which, by the way, on Monday said that they wanted to see efficacy data. And sorry, on Friday said they wanted to see efficacy data, and on Saturday were willing to accept what had been provided to them. It seems that they were also very heavily swayed by the idea that this vaccine might work better against the variant strain. That seems like an argument that has been discounted by the results of Pfizer and Moderna, indicating that their vaccines are also working very well against the variant strains. And this is an answer that we've got with 1 week of extra testing, right? So if we really had doubts and we really wanted to understand which vaccines are working against the variant strain, shouldn't we be trying both vaccines or all vaccines rather than saying, well, we think this one might work better? It's again an article of faith versus actual science and evidence.
And as far as inoculation process is concerned, ma'am, do we know how many people will be given what vaccine so far? Do you have an idea of how many people will be given Covishield versus Covaxin? We know for a fact that Covishield will be given on priority basis, Covaxin will not be. But we really have no clue of how many people will be given what.
We actually don't know that. Okay, so the only example I can give you from what has happened before when we've had different products is that states are assigned a product. So, this state will get this product, that state will get that product, and you have no choice in the matter. Will the government choose to do that with Covishield and Covaxin? I guess we will hear fairly soon from the committees that are deciding that. But at least from what I'm hearing, I'm not hearing from media reports or anything else, that there is going to be a decision that is going to be based on the epidemiology of viral outbreaks. That when we see this variant strain, only then will we use Covaxin. What we are hearing instead is of a rollout that is going to go countrywide for priority populations. It doesn't sound like there is going to be a calibration that is based on which strain is circulating where.
Ma'am, you said that for Covishield, we at least have the data. But is the data made public? Because there is no clarity on that. A lot of people that I spoke to, experts that I spoke to, said that we don't have data either for Covishield or for Covaxin. It's not been made public yet.
It's not usual for companies to make their data public before the regulator reviews the data, right? That did happen in the case of Pfizer and Moderna and AstraZeneca, where the papers that related to the efficacy studies were submitted before the full FDA review and the full MHRA review and determination. But that's unusual. And even there, obviously, there are questions because when your paper has a word limit of 3,000 or 5,000 words, you can't get everything in there with supplementary documentation. Now, the FDA publishes its own review. FDA asks for the raw data and it publishes its own review of the data that it has obtained. And even with that, there are scientists that have doubts about whether that is sufficient or not. If you read what Peter Doshi has put out from the BMJ has put out, he has lots of doubts about the Pfizer data, some of which I agree with, some of which I think is asking for more than we have seen for any other vaccine trial. And perhaps given the fact that this is a very, very unusual situation, even greater transparency than we have ever had before is a good thing. But for the MHRA puts out a summary statement, but not the same level of detailing that the FDA does. And AstraZeneca is doing a trial in the US, so we will have a similar analysis done by the FDA when that trial reaches its endpoints, which looks like it's going to be a few months yet. But we also know that the MHRA has been very engaged and has been doing a rolling review of the data from, I believe, May onwards of all of the trials that the AstraZeneca product has gone through. Is that sufficient for us? Well, it depends. So MHRA is a trusted regulator. They know what they're doing their job. And they're used to reviewing all kinds of data from all kinds of products, even though the UK is not actually before being a vaccine manufacturing nation. So a lot of regulators rely on each other, like the DCGI in India has agreements with the FDA, agreements with the MHRA. And I'm sure they've discussed from the DCGI's office what the MHRA decisions were, what the data were, and have then come to their determination about Covishield. But I think for Covishield, I would have been a lot happier if they had finished their 1600-person trial and put that data out. Because they are doing a smaller study, they really should be having the data out as early as possible. And it's not impossible for them to do. And I certainly hope that they do it soon. So with Covaxin, it's another story. There is currently no efficacy data available. So if regulators elsewhere are going to look for efficacy data, they are most likely going to wait until the clinical efficacy trial is done and then accept that vaccine for use within their systems. So I understand, will be continuing the trials. And while that absolutely must be done, my worry right now is what happens to all of the vaccines that are coming after Covishield and Covaxin. What are we going to ask of them? What are we going to ask of people that we want to recruit into the trials? What are we going to tell them about what is available, what has been shown to work, what is being done in the country. So, for example, even with Covaxin, imagine a situation where out of your 25,800 people, um, 5,000 of them are healthcare workers. Now, if healthcare workers are in your priority group and you've made a commitment to vaccinate all healthcare workers, once you vaccinate everybody who is in that study and has received a placebo, right, what will you do? You have essentially shrunk the size of your trial, and your trial was already pretty small compared to international standards. And you're going to take that much longer to accumulate your data. And here is a trial that has finished recruitment. What happens to Zydus Cadila, right? Zydus Cadila will now not be able to recruit healthcare workers or essential workers because they are going to be in their first group to be vaccinated. Should they then be recruiting from the 260, 70 million people above the age of 50 who are going to be in the priority groups and immunized by July? That means for Zydus Cadila, we are never going to have efficacy in over 50-year-olds. What is it that we are setting ourselves up for by doing this? I don't think we have a very clear understanding of that, and we really should.
To me as a journalist, ma'am, and more so as a citizen, it looks like there is perhaps no policy or plan in place. From what you're pointing out, it looks like there is no plan in place, and that adds to the hesitancy to take the vaccine. A lot of people that I have spoken to personally, and even in the newsrooms, are hesitant to take the vaccine at the moment.
I think this vaccine hesitancy was going to be an issue anyway, right? Because people can't believe that it is possible for scientists and technologists to develop a vaccine so quickly. It's never been done before. Corners must have been cut, is the usual interpretation that people have. So I've been spending months and months and months talking to people, trying to convince them that in the clinical testing pathways, we have not taken shortcuts. And now I can't say that anymore. And it's a very difficult position to be in personally, because my entire training is, generate the evidence, trust the evidence. Don't go by what you believe. The whole idea of randomized controlled trials comes from an unbiased assessment of whether a treatment works or doesn't work, or a prevention works or doesn't work. And now we are asked to take it on the basis of some evidence that the vaccine is immunogenic, but not necessarily sufficient information on whether it's safe and effective. You could argue about, what is safe enough, what is effective enough. But I'll use an argument from a hospital setting. One of the things that we always discuss as doctors is you don't want to be treated as a VIP, because everybody is so careful and edgy around you that sometimes they offset what they would normally do for a patient to treat you in a special manner, and that can lead to unnecessary complications. The intention is to do the best, but what happens ultimately is, because you've changed routine practice for what you think is a special situation, you actually wind up not doing your best, which is what years and years and years of experience have taught you. We call this VIP syndrome. And the first thing we say when we get admitted into hospital is, I do not want to be treated as a VIP, just go about it like normal. So, because quite frankly, systems and experience have been established for a purpose. So when we change that, we should be very careful and intentional and understand the risks that we are taking by doing that.
You know, are you now suddenly finding yourself caught up in this entire debate about building trust versus questioning the system? As a person of science, how are you coping up with this, controversy that you've been dragged into while all you were doing perhaps was your job?
It is really hard because my entire life has been around making sure that whatever evidence we generate uh, is fit for purpose. And more recently, I've realized that while I may be convinced by a scientific article, uh, people more generally have many more sources of information than the scientific journals that I read, or the meetings that I go to, or the people that I interact with. So, therefore, having credible scientists who know what they're doing, talk to people, has been a very important part of what I've tried to do in the last few months. I mean, it's not my preferred option to go to the media or to, be on Twitter or something. But I also think that it's my responsibility to society to share what I know and to try and tell people about why the processes of science are so important, the purpose for which we do them. Why do you study safety? Why do you study immunogenicity? Why do you study efficacy? Why do you have post marketing surveillance? The entire idea is to deliver something to people that is safe and efficacious, to protect people from harm. That is our responsibility. And to communicate that has been increasingly important to me. So it's been a challenge. It's
Dr.
even
Kang.
more of a challenge now.
Yes, we saw articles about you after your interviews to various publications. As a person of science, I imagine must be difficult to deal with the controversy that's got very little to do with science.
Yes, that's true. It's I am who I am in my personal life, in my professional life. I saw a couple of things highlighted, and friends have been sending me stuff. I keep telling them, as a Sikh in a Christian institution, I've been a minority in a minority institution for 30 years, and it's really taught me a lot about how to handle different points of view and to try and integrate them to make sure that you're doing the right kinds of things. Um, so, yeah, it's not simple. There are all kinds of allegations. I have no political affiliations. I think Nota is fantastic because it allows me to be a citizen.
Absolutely.
But yeah,
Dr. Khan,
but
thanks very much, ma'am. Thank you very much for your time. And I hope that you continue to impart on us the scientific knowledge, the scientific temperament that perhaps many of us here in India need to still develop. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. My name is Shweta Kothari, ma'am, in case I didn't
Yes,
introduce myself.
you
Yes,
had mailed me,
I
Shweta.
mailed you just a couple of minutes back. Thank you so much for your time, and truly appreciate the fact that you're facing. I think a sort of a storm that's going to die down in a bit. That is what it is about media. It's a rage that dies down very quickly, and we've all been there. And thank you for your service, ma'am.
Thanks, Shweta. And I like reading uh, what So I'm on a mailing list that sends me what is in the Logical Indian.
Right.
So I enjoyed that.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, ma'am. You have a good day. Bye.